Well, I want to welcome everyone to the September 9th, 2020 speaker program for the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois. This is the first program for our current business year, which runs from July 2020 through June of 2021. My name is Bruce Strom, and I am the new board president for the current business year. The World Affairs Council of Central Illinois is also referred to by the acronym for its name, which is WACCI, WACCI. WACCI is a chapter of a national organization called the World Affairs Council of America. Our chapter was established in 1988. The mission of WACCI is to provide to residents in Central Illinois communities information about foreign policy issues and international relations, and to provide a forum for discussing these things. Its purpose also includes promoting and fostering international understanding of global issues. WACCI receives support from NPR Illinois, which provides publicity for our programs. This provides residents in the area with information regarding WACCI programs, including the topic, the speaker, the date and time, and the location of each presentation. In addition, WACCI receives support from the University of Illinois at Springfield, from Lincoln Land Community College, and from Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. We have automatically muted the microphone for each of you as you join tonight's Zoom program. For the duration of the speaker's presentation, we ask that everyone keep their microphone muted. After the speaker has finished his presentation, there will be a question and answer period, and we will explain the process for asking questions at that time. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Steve Schwark, who is a member of the WACCI Program Committee. Dr. Schwark has been our contact person for scheduling tonight's speaker, and he will introduce the speaker now. Dr. Schwark.
Dr. Gregory Gause, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Gregory Gause is professor and head of the Department of International Affairs in the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. He is an expert on the international politics of the Middle East, has written numerous books and articles that have been published in magazines like Foreign Affairs. This is not the first time that Dr. Gause has addressed the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois. I well remember in January of 2002, 4 months after the events of 9/11, that Dr. Gause came to our campus to talk about Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Tonight's talk is, of course, on a different topic, the growing rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, what some people call perhaps a new regional Cold War in the Middle East. Dr. Gause.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back in Springfield, if only virtually. And hopefully sometime very, very soon we'll be able to get together physically again. These things are just not the same over Zoom, and I'm missing being able to see everyone and interact with you. But we do the best we can under the circumstances. So let me just explain a little bit before I go into the slides so you don't have to look at my face the whole time. What I mean by a new Middle East Cold War. Why is it new? Well, this isn't the first time that regional powers and outside great powers have intervened in the politics and the domestic politics of countries in the Middle East in an attempt to shift the balance of power in the region in their favor. One of the interesting things about the Middle East is that those balance of power fights are not only about who has the biggest army or who has the biggest economy, but also who has the most attractive ideas, right? The ability to mobilize people across borders based upon ideologies and identities is as much a power resource as the ability to spend money someplace or the ability to send guns someplace or the ability to send your own troops into a fight. And so this is a somewhat more complicated regional international picture, but also I think more interesting intellectually because of that. Now, lots of people have talked about the Saudi-Iranian rivalry in the Middle East as a sectarian fight. And one of the things I want to do tonight in a brief kind of 25 minutes that I'll be presenting, 30 minutes before we open it up for question, is to try to get you to think another way about the conflict in the Middle East. Which is not to say sectarianism is not important, but in my mind, it's not the driver. So let me share my screen. And we can get into this. So this is a region-wide crisis. If you just start in North Africa and go over in 2019, popular uprisings brought down the president of Algeria. Tunisia, of course, was where the Arab Spring of 2011 began, with the ouster of the president and what has been the one relative success story in a transition to democracy in the Arab world since the uprisings of 2011. Oops, sorry, go back. Libya, of course, is a brutal civil war. Egypt saw massive uprisings in 2011, the overthrow of the Mubarak regime, free elections to a parliament, and then the election of a president, Mohamed Morsi, who represented the Muslim Brotherhood in 2012, his overthrow in a military coup in 2013, led by General Abdel Fattah Sisi, who is now the president of Egypt. And Egypt, while it has held together, it hasn't experienced a civil war, has experienced, I think, a crisis of governance. We can look at Lebanon, where, as we know, just a couple of weeks ago, a huge explosion in downtown Beirut devastated the center of the city, killed hundreds, made tens of thousands homeless. And it was a symbol of the collapse of state authority in Lebanon, right? Lebanon experienced a civil war beginning in 1975, and it really has never put together a coherent state since. Syria, of course, has seen civil war since 2011 in the Arab uprisings. Yemen, also civil war since 2011 in the Arab uprisings. Iraq, right? A decline of state capacity under Saddam Hussein after he lost the Gulf War, sanctions were put on, and then the United States in 2003 invading and destroying the state. We can go out to Afghanistan, of course, which has also experienced a real collapse of state authority since the Soviet invasion, way back in 1979. So we're talking about a region-wide crisis. Now, as I said, a lot of people say that the cause of this crisis, or the motor of this crisis, is the sectarian split between Sunni and Shia in the Middle East. The countries where you see in kind of light yellow are overwhelmingly Sunni. The greener the country, the larger the percentage of Shia in the country. In questions, if people would like to get into the history and the identity markers and the theology of the Sunni-Shia split, I'd be happy to do that. But I think for the purposes here, we just have to know that these are the two major sectarian groups within Islam. Iran, overwhelmingly Shia. Iraq, majority Shia. Bahrain, small island country here in the Persian Gulf, majority Shia. And then substantial, Lebanon, plurality Shia population. And then substantial Shia minorities in Yemen, fewer in Turkey and Syria, but still there. Also in the UAE and in Kuwait. Now, the argument is that the Iranians, since the revolution, have wanted to spread Shiism, and the Saudis, who have as their state interpretation of Islam what we in the West call Wahhabism, what people in the Middle East would more likely call Salafism, and Salaf, the Salaf is the Arabic word for the ancestors. This notion that the Saudis practice a version of Islam that goes back to, right, the pious ancestors, the first Muslim community, those around the Prophet who established the first Islamic community in the Arabian Peninsula. I'm not going to say that sectarianism is not important, right? People are getting killed because of their sectarian identity. But I'm going to ask you to think that, or at least put that aside for a moment, as I suggest perhaps another explanation. So first off, is this a Sunni-Shia conflict? Well, I would argue that there's lots of reasons to question that framework as the best framework for us to understand politics in the region, right? We see civil wars in places where there are no sectarian tensions. Almost everybody in Libya is a Sunni Muslim, right? We see people in the Sinai Peninsula rebelling against the Egyptian government. In the Palestinian territories, we see Hamas and the Palestinian Authority split, right? We see in places where sectarianism does not drive conflict, like Afghanistan, right? There are Shia in Afghanistan, but the fight in Afghanistan is not between Sunnis and Shia, right? It's between people who support the government that was set up by the United States after we invaded in 2001 and the Taliban, right? Sunnis against Sunnis. I'd also argue that the Sunni-Shia framing here is an oversimplification, right? In Iraq, one of the major players in politics are the Kurds. You've got Sunni Kurds, you've got Shia Kurds. The Kurds are a linguistic group, if you will, an ethno-national group. They're not Arabs, they're not Persians, they're not Turks, they have their own language. Right? In Lebanon, it's not Sunnis and Shias alone, there are Lebanese Christians, and they've divided, some of them allying with Hezbollah and some of them allying with the movements that have supported the Sunni, leading Sunni political figures in Lebanon. And I don't want to get too much into history and theology here, but the Assad regime in Syria is based on a break-off group from Shiism, a small minority in the Syrian population called Alawis. And I think if you asked 100 Shia ulama, the men of religion, if the Alawis are really Shia, my guess is 90 of them would say no. It's also important to note that both Saudi Arabia and Iran try to transcend sectarianism. Right? The Saudis have been reaching out to the government in Iraq to try to kind of wean it away from a close relationship with Iran, even though the prime minister of Iraq is as Shia as anyone in Iran is. And the Iranians, of course, have for decades championed the cause of the Palestinians, been extremely anti-Israeli, and they claim to lead the axis of resistance. Right? And the Iranians have had quite a bit of influence in the region. And this picture over here on the right is a formation of their most successful militia that they support in the Arab world, Hezbollah. And finally, as we go through the talk, I'll talk about the fact that within the Sunni community itself, there's quite a bit of tension and conflict within the Sunni community. And thus, a Sunni-Shia framework doesn't help us understand that. And that's a really important part of the tensions that are occurring in the region. So, if you're with me so far, right, and you're saying, okay, maybe this guy is right, that maybe the Sunni-Shia split isn't the real driver of this, maybe we should think in alternative terms, find an alternative framework. Here's where I try to give you one. I think that the real root cause of this region-wide crisis has been in domestic politics. It has been the weakness or the breakdown of state authority throughout the region. And let's just think for a minute. When authority breaks down in a country, it means that it's much easier for outsiders to intervene in its politics. And the more of these political vacuums that you have in a region, the more you can argue that the entire region is dominated by this kind of political vacuum that sucks in the outsiders, both regional powers and international powers, into civil wars, because those civil wars and who wins those civil wars is going to determine the geopolitical future of the region. So to me, it's weak states. It's the collapse of the state, the weakening of state authority that sets the stage for the political fights we're seeing in the region. Now, this weakness and collapse of state authority doesn't all have a single explanation. Lebanon and Yemen, two of the countries where we are seeing external intervention, have been historically weak states for all sorts of reasons. We can get into that in questions. Now, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was a relatively strong state. And by strong state, I mean it had a relatively good control over its domestic society. Now, a lot of that was terror and violence, right? But it controlled its borders and was able to maintain stability and security within its borders for the regime and prevent outsiders from intervening and prevent challengers from emerging. But we know that the Iraqi regime in the 90s got weaker. And then in 2003, the United States, as an instrument or as a direct active policy, invaded Iraq and destroyed the Iraqi state, right? That wasn't an accident. We set out to destroy the Iraqi state, right? We banned the ruling party, we disbanded the military, and we made it extremely difficult for anyone who had been in the bureaucracy before at the top levels to hold an important position in the civil governance in Iraq. So the three pillars of the modern authoritarian third world state, the ruling party, the military, and the bureaucracy, the United States destroyed them in the misbegotten belief that it could rebuild an Iraqi state from the ground up. Well, we know America failed in that. In the Palestinian Authority in 2007, we saw Fatah and Hamas split between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. An incipient state, a state in the making, split. And then, of course, the Arab Spring, right? We see the collapse of the state in Syria and Libya with civil war. We see a weak state in Yemen pushed to civil war. We see Egypt, right? And the tensions within the Sunni world between the Muslim Brotherhood and, if you will, secular is the wrong word, but political forces that don't accept that Islam should be the central element of the politics of the country, right? I have a picture over here on the right? The gentleman in the jacket and tie is Mohammed Morsi. He was the elected Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt. The guy he appointed as his defense minister was Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the guy standing right next to him, who overthrew him a year after he was elected president. These were in happier days before the military coup. And the Arab Spring, to some extent, isn't over. Right? We saw a change of government in Sudan and in Algeria in 2019. We saw demonstrations in Lebanon in 2019. And what we're also seeing currently is further weakening of the states in the region. COVID, which has hit the Middle East, many states in the Middle East hard, is making it more challenging for governance, is driving down the economy. And then the collapse of oil prices is also harming the regional economies. So we're still seeing this crisis of state authority throughout the region. So what happens when the state ceases to do its job? What happens when the state can no longer provide security and stability and a decent economy? Well, militias grow up. And we have two pictures of militias here. This one down here is probably familiar to folks, that black banner. Those are the ISIS guys, right? The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria that has been militarily pushed back from its successes in 2014 when it overran the northern parts of Iraq and many parts of the north of Iraq, including the second largest city in Iraq, Mosul, and looked like it might be able to take over Baghdad. This militia up here carrying the coffins was also in Iraq. It's called Sa'ad al-Haq, which is a Shia militia supported by Iran, right, that fought against the United States, fought against ISIS, and has fought against other opponents in the region. This is not an Iraqi state force. This is an independent force armed and supported by Iran. So when the state ceases to be able to perform its functions, you see militias. You see a war economy grow up, right? In which the normal economy ceases to function regularly, and what you get is black markets, you get contraband, you get illegal trade, you get human trafficking, you get warlords taking over economic systems within the countries. And thus, powerful people who have guns then have an interest in not getting back to normal life because they make money off the conflict, off the absence of the state's authority. And also, very clearly, terrorist groups like ISIS can find a base in a country when the government ceases to be able to do its job. But we should also note that when the government ceases to be able to provide safety and security for people, they look for safety and security somewhere else. They look for it in their communities where they feel safe, where they can go to and they feel people will not kill them, where they can go if they've lost their job and have nothing to eat, and they have a reasonable expectation that they'll be taken care of. In many parts of the Eastern Arab world, those communities, for various historical reasons, have been sectarian, have been Sunni or Shia, Christian in Lebanon, Alawi in Syria. Now that sectarian, those communities aren't always sectarian. As I said, the Kurds in Iraq have been an extremely important community where fellow Kurds have looked to for support and safety in times of distress. But my point here is not that it's that the Iranians and the Saudis aren't imposing sectarianism on Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen, right? That sectarianism is coming from the bottom up, right? As people seek safety and security with the collapse of the state and the beginning of civil war. And those groups, some of them sectarian, some of them not, they desperately want the outsiders to come in. And it's natural that Shia groups would look to Iran, the largest and most powerful Shia country in the region. It's natural that Sunni groups would look to Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Egypt for support, right? The major Sunni countries in the region. So that sectarianism isn't imposed from the outside, it bubbles up from underneath. And the Saudis and the Iranians and the Turks and the Emiratis and the Qataris, the people with money, right? They don't fight their way into these civil wars. They're invited into these civil wars because the people fighting these civil wars are fighting for their life and their future. And they will take money and guns and political support and military support from anyone who will give it to them. So in this crisis of the state, Iran, I think, has a real advantage, at least in the Eastern Arab world. It's well positioned to take advantage of state weakness in Lebanon, in Iraq, and Palestine, and Syria, and Yemen, and perhaps even in the Gulf states, because they have these sectarian connections to the Shia communities there, who look to Iran for support at times of political crisis. Because Iran has been the champion of the Palestinian cause and the axis of resistance against Israel throughout the Arab world, at a time when many Arab states, we just saw the UAE just last week, when many Arab states are making their peace with Israel, either formally or informally. And the Iranian regime has had a strong state-to-state alliance with the Assad regime in Syria since the 1980s. So the Iranians have money, right? Not as much as the Saudis, but they have money. And they have loyal allies like Hezbollah, like the Assad regime in Syria, like the Houthis in Yemen, like the Iraqi Shia militias, like the Afghan Shia militias. And they have their own forces, the Quds Force, which used to be headed up by this guy down here in the lower right-hand corner, General Qasem Soleimani, commander of the Quds Force until he was killed by an American drone weapon back at the end of 2019. at the orders of the Trump administration. Now, Saudi Arabia saw the civil wars in Syria and Yemen as their best chance to roll back Iranian influence in the region, but they failed. And they failed not because they don't have money. They've got plenty of money. They've got more money than the Iranians have. But the Saudis lack two things that the Iranians do have. First, the Saudis don't have reliable troops that can get the job done across their borders. They really have had no success in deploying their troops outside their borders. And Yemen, the Yemen experiment, where the Saudis with their Emirati allies sent troops into the Yemeni civil war in 2015, has of course been a failure. This is an Emirati tank, armored personnel carrier, in the streets of Aden in the southern part of Yemen in 2015. The Saudis were mostly from the air, but sent some of their troops into parts of Yemen. But Yemen has become a quagmire for the Saudis, and they've not been able to dislodge the Houthis, right? So the Saudis can't use their own forces with the same efficiency that Iran has. But I'd also argue that the most important reason that the Saudis have not been as successful as the Iranians in this new Middle East Cold War is they don't have reliable regional allies. So the Iranians have allies who want to work with them, who share their ideological point of view. It's not just a sectarian connection, it's also an ideological connection. Hezbollah, the Iraqi militias, the Afghan Shia militias. These are militias that Iran helped to set up, inculcated Iranian ideology, the ideology of the Islamic Republic of Iran within these militias, and thus these militias are willing participants in Iranian strategies in the region, right? Hezbollah goes to Syria to fight on behalf of the Assad regime because that's what Iran wants them to do, right? Afghan and Iraqi militia forces go to Syria to fight for the Assad regime because that's what Iran wants them to do, and they're willing to do that. The Houthis in Yemen, right? My soundbite on them is that they want to be Iranian clients more than Iran wants to be their patron. That's how ideologically committed they are to the Iranian cause. Think about who the quote unquote natural allies of the Saudis would be. The people who kind of share their ideology, at least parts of it. Well, that would be ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Although they're very different from the Saudis in terms of their political views, they share that kind of narrow, xenophobic, puritanical interpretation of Islam, right? That we call Wahhabism, and locally it's called Salafism, right? So the problem for the Saudis is their quote unquote natural allies hate them and want to kill them. The only thing the Saudis can do is use their money to try to buy allies in these civil wars. But we know you can't buy people, you can only rent them. And thus the Saudis don't have the kind of power resources that the Iranians have in this fight. I said that one of the things that argues against a Sunni Shia sectarian framing of the fight in the Middle East is that the Sunni world itself is divided. Really, there are three political, ideological forces playing into the fight for political power in the Sunni world in the Middle East. The Muslim Brotherhood won electoral victories in Tunisia and Egypt, right? Those victories were reversed in Egypt by military coup. They were reversed in Tunisia by a subsequent election. But the Muslim Brotherhood is still an important player in the politics of Syria and Egypt and Jordan and Libya to some extent, and Tunisia, where it's the Ennahda party that represents the Brotherhood. And importantly, the Brotherhood has important external supporters. Turkey, a large and relatively successful political entity in the Middle East, led by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, this fellow right here, has been very supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Qatari regime, very small monarchy in the Gulf, but fabulously wealthy from natural gas, has been willing to spend money to support the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the region. The Qataris gave Mohammed Morsi billions of dollars when he was in power. And the Qataris supported Muslim Brotherhood groups in the Syrian civil war. Turkey gave Islamist groups, both Brotherhood groups and other groups, safe haven in Turkey, to use Turkey as a base to fight in the Syrian civil war. And just recently, the Turks have sent their own troops and allied militia that they have from Syria into Libya to support their allies in the Libyan civil war. Another ideological and political trend is represented by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They don't like the Muslim Brotherhood, right? They're top-down Islamists. They're not bottom-up Islamists. They're not populists, right? They supported the coup by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi against the Muslim Brotherhood, right? They're putting pressure on Qatar, the Saudis, and the UAE to back off their support for the regional Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, the Saudis and the UAE intervened in Yemen in 2015 to try to push back the Houthis, who are allies of Iran. So the Saudis and the UAE stand against Iran, but they also stand against the Muslim Brotherhood. And then you have the third Sunni Islamist trend in the region, which is Salafi jihadism, which is ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They don't like Turkey, they don't like the Muslim Brotherhood, they don't like the Saudis, they don't like the UAE. They have their own vision of what Islamist government should look like. And so when you consider the Sunni world, if this were actually a Sunni-Shia fight, right, the Sunnis don't have their act together. And to understand the dynamics of Libya, sectarianism doesn't help you, but this split among the Sunni powers does. Right? To understand the split between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in the Palestinian territories, sectarianism doesn't help you. But this framework does. To understand why the Sunni rebels in Syria, who make up about 75% of the population, 70 to 75% of the population in Syria, couldn't win that civil war, the divisions among their various backers gives us some indication of why. So where's the United States in all of this? Well, President Trump came into office saying America first. He was tired of the endless wars in the Middle East. And many people thought he would be less committed to the region. But we really haven't seen much withdrawal of American forces. The president has talked about drawing down troops in Iraq that we just announced yesterday. There has been some drawdown in Afghanistan, but there's roughly the same number of American troops in the Middle East now as there were when President Trump came to office. One of the reasons that he's been unable to withdraw from the Middle East is because he also wants to pursue a policy of being tougher on Iran, maximum pressure on Iran. And a maximum pressure policy on Iran doesn't have much credibility if you're withdrawing all your military forces from the region. But the president is certainly hesitant to order major military actions. He did order bombings in Syria after the use of chemical weapons, but he didn't follow that up. And probably the most interesting indication of his reluctance to get involved in the region came in September of 2019, when the Iranians conducted unprecedented attacks on Saudi oil facilities. Really the most important single oil facility in the world is the Saudi gathering plant at Abqaiq, where almost 6 million barrels a day of oil come in, are processed and separated, and then sent out to tankers to be shipped out. Iranian drone and missile attacks basically took that facility out for over a month and took 5% of the world's oil supply, not Saudi oil supply, the world's oil supply off the market. Well, for decades, the United States said the reason that it was in the Persian Gulf militarily was to protect the free flow of oil. But in this case, the Trump administration did very little in response. Weeks later, they killed Qasem Soleimani, but there was no concerted effort to try to deter the Iranians from future attacks on Saudi oil facilities by an attack on, say, the missile installations in Iran from which those attacks were launched. The other thing about the Trump administration, of course, that argues against a quick withdrawal from the region is it's very pro-Israel, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, supporting the Likud government, and thus, I think, reluctant to get out of the Middle East because they have a very strong pro-Israeli stance. So, if you're buying what I'm selling, what we're seeing in the Middle East now is a region-wide crisis that has its roots in the collapse and weakening of domestic governance authority. That collapse and weakening of authority allows sub-state identities, like sectarianism, like Sunnism, like Shiism, but also like ethno-national identities, ideological movements, terrorist groups, regional identities, tribal identities, to reemerge and to serve as mobilizing points in civil conflicts. These political vacuums then attract regional and external powers into these fights. Some of these fights do have a sectarian element, but these people are not killing each other simply because Sunnis don't like Shia and Shia don't like Sunnis. They're killing each other over a fight over what their politics is going to look like now that their governments have either collapsed or severely weakened. So I'm more than happy to answer questions. I'm sorry I went on a little longer, but I hope that providing this alternative framework might give us a starting point to discuss where things are going in the region.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gause. We really appreciate that you made time this evening to support WACI and share your knowledge. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. So thank you, thank you. We now enter the Q&A portion of our evening. We have about 15 minutes for the discussion, and we will be using the raise hand function in Zoom to facilitate the Q&A. So if you've never used this before, you will click on the Participants tab on the lower left of your screen. Then next to your name, you will see the Raise Hand button. If you have a question, please click to raise your hand. Dr. Adriana Crocker will be facilitating the discussion this evening. And once Dr. Crocker has called your name, you may unmute yourself and ask your question. Please only one question at a time. And once your question has been answered, please unmute or please mute yourself again, and then we will move on to the next person. Okay.
Hi there. So my question is, how do you feel about the future of the PMGs that are currently operating in Iraq? Do you think they will be integrated into the Iraqi army anytime soon, or will they maintain de facto independence and allegiance to Iran in the long run?
So now you're asking me to go on the record predicting the future, which will set me up for all sorts of problems, but that's okay. So for everybody, PMGs are popular mobilization groups, the militias, some of which arose in reaction to the ISIS campaign in 2014-15, some of which arose previously under Iranian tutelage. These groups tend to be, for the most part, very closely allied with Iran. And so formally, there's been an effort to integrate them into the Iraqi state, but let's face it, they don't take their orders from the prime minister, right? They take their orders from their own commanders who consult with the Iranians, right? The reason that Qasem Soleimani was in Baghdad when the Trump administration killed him is because he was there to consult with not just the Iraqi government, but also the heads of these militia groups, right? One of the head of one of the groups, I think it was Asad al-Haq, was killed with Soleimani, when the drone got them. So I think it's really good. It's going to be extremely difficult to integrate the popular mobilization groups, in Arabic, they call them the Hashd al-Sha'bi, into the Iraqi army, because I don't think the Iranians want that, and I'm not sure the Iraqi army wants it. So I would guess that it will be very difficult. So there, I'm on the record.
Well, we have another question. C.D. Bear, whoever it is. Okay, go ahead.
Rich Burning here. Doctor, thank you for taking the time on this, but you made a reference at the beginning about the balance of power. And the second point, of course, our American policy in the Mideast has been to keep the free flow of oil going. Now, that policy comes back when we had $80, $90, $100 oil. We're now at $39 oil, and we are producing a lot of oil out of our own country. What should be our policy today?
So these are excellent points, and I think that it's becoming something of conventional wisdom in Washington circles that the Middle East is not as important as it used to be, and not just because people are tired of it in Iraq and Afghanistan that burned them, but also because they just don't see Middle East oil as being that important anymore. But I think that the strategic importance of Middle East oil was never about what America imported, right? The United States saw the Middle East as a strategic area during the Cold War when we didn't import a single drop of oil from the Middle East, right, in the 50s and 60s. The Middle East is still the place where most of the oil that is used in seaborne trade comes from, right? And where does that oil go these days? It goes to East Asia. It goes to China, goes to it goes to South Korea, it goes to Japan, it goes to the Southeast Asian countries. And in that sense, it still has a very important strategic element to it. And I think that if we see ourselves coming into a Cold War with China, having some political leverage in the world's oil patch could be an asset in that geopolitical contest with China. So I think that you could make an argument. I think you can also make an argument that even though the United States is producing a fair amount of oil now, prices are determined as much by what happens in the Middle East as by what happens anywhere else. And Saudi Arabia remains really the only country in the world that can bring a lot of oil to market or take a lot of oil off the market in the short term. And so American presidents, Republicans and Democrats, for decades have wanted to have a relationship with Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia has that leverage in the oil market.
Okay, here I cannot unmute you. Lisa?
Yeah, I'd like to know what your opinion is of the presidents having moved the embassy to Jerusalem on various conflicts in the Middle East. Did it have any impact?
So I don't think it had much. Actually, the salience of the Arab-Israeli conflict has certainly gone down in the region. It's not the thing that mobilizes people in the Arab world the way it used to. Now, that doesn't mean that people in the Arab world don't care about the Palestinian cause anymore. It still polls very favorably, right? And you know, there are reasons why it was the United Arab Emirates that made the public overture to Israel, because in essence, the United Arab Emirates doesn't have a domestic political system, right? 90% of the people who live in the Emirates are foreigners. The citizens are not only a very small in number, but you know, enjoy a very nice lifestyle for the most part because of the enormous wealth in the Emirates. And there's really no formal avenue through which Emiratis can affect the politics of their country. You see, the Saudis are not taking that public stance, even though they're cooperating with the Israelis on all sorts of things, because there's still public opinion in Saudi Arabia. And it would be risky to go public with a relationship with the Israelis, right? Okay, all that being said, I think it was a mistake to move the embassy to Jerusalem at this time, because what did the US get for it? Not much. It seems to me that if you're serious about a two-state solution between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and I think there's still good reason for the United States to be serious about a two-state solution between Palestinians and Israelis, you don't want to give the Israeli government everything they want before they get to the table to make that deal. And so for somebody who wrote The Art of the Deal, I'm not sure that President Trump was such a great deal maker on that one. But I think we know from the president's own public statements that the move of the embassy to Jerusalem had very little to do with international politics and a lot to do with domestic politics.
Yes, Fletcher. You need to unmute. Let me see if I can unmute you. Can you unmute Fletcher, please?
Yeah, can you say more about the
there. Go ahead.
The implications of the Cold War in the Middle East for Israel? Is there a chance that this will lead to some kind of stability there, or is Israel continually under threat?
So I think a lot depends on who wins. Obviously, the Iranian regime has a very hostile position toward Israel, ideologically hostile. And Hezbollah has engaged in a conflict with Israel and Israel with Hezbollah a number of times. To the extent that the Iranians cement their position in Syria, that could reopen Golan as a possible front in Israeli-Arab, in this case maybe Israeli-Iranian confrontation. Much of the Sunni Arab world is either formally at peace with Israel, Egypt and Jordan, and now the UAE. Not that that makes that much difference. The UAE is, what, 1,500 miles away. Or has basically accepted that Israel is a part and parcel of the geopolitics of the region, and they'll do deals with it. And that would be Saudi Arabia. And frankly, the Palestinian Authority, right? Yasser Arafat is willing to do deals with Israel. And thus, I think a lot depends on how the Middle East Cold War works out. But there's another issue as well, and that's internal to Israel itself, right? I think that Israeli politics is also very divided between those who see the integration of as much of the West Bank as possible into the state of Israel to be settled by Israeli Jews as a goal of the ultimate goal of the Zionist dream, right, to recover the land of Israel. And those on the more center to the left in Israeli politics who think that the more you consolidate control over territories that have huge numbers of Palestinians in them, the harder it is for Israel to sustain itself as a Jewish state and a democratic state at the same time, right? Because if you're not going to let these people that you govern in the West Bank to vote, even though you're going to rule them kind of in perpetuity, it calls into question the democratic values of the state. And so this is a question that Israelis are going to have to answer, because they're not going to get much pressure from the world. The salience of the Palestinian issue is just not what it was back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and even into the 90s, the last time that the United States made a concerted effort to try to broker a two-state solution in the Clinton administration. And so, I think a lot will depend on how Israeli politics itself goes, how this develops. But Israel is certainly not threatened by conventional warfare, by strong states on its border the way it was, say, in the 40s and 50s and 60s. It's threatened by non-state actors like Hezbollah. It's threatened by Iran at distance with missiles. It's a different kind of security threat.
Thank you.
Well, I have a question then, since I don't see any hands. You were discussing the issue of weak institutions in several Middle Eastern countries that led to foreign intervention. My question is, can democracy work in the Middle East given the very sectarian conflicts that still remain in many of the domestic affairs, And if we can, what kind of institutions should we build in order for democracy to work?
I think democracy can work in the Middle East. It's worked at least partially well in Tunisia. But democracy can't work where there's no state. I mean, you have to have a state to have a democracy. You have to have some sense of stability and security. You have to have an administrative cadre that can actually operate elections. You have to have some sense of common citizenship that people will accept electoral results. Elections are really bad ways to solve civil wars. We didn't solve our civil war with an election, if you'll recall your American history, right? An election started our civil war, and our civil war ended with the military defeat of one states and the military occupation of the area that was in rebellion against the United States. I can say that from Texas because, you know, we were one of the areas that was occupied. And so I think that the problem in the Middle East is not that there's some inherent obstacle to democracy, whether it's Islam or sectarianism or whatever. I think that the problem in the Middle East is that right now you have weak institutions, and you got to solve the problem of governance before you can get to the issue of democracy. Then there are other obstacles that, you know, we could spend an entire hour talking about. Having lots of oil in your country is not particularly conducive to democracy, right? For all sorts of reasons, right? And yes, if you have within your borders people who don't share even a minimal sense of state identity, then democracy just frequently just becomes a census taking of, you know, who's on what side and who's on the other. And that's not a recipe for stable governance. If democracy doesn't lead to stable governance, democracy will fail.
Here, Robert.
Yes, Bob Geckel. I have a question about the role of Russia and the efforts by President Putin to reinsert Russia into the politics of the Middle East, and I'm wondering how that affects the Cold War you're discussing between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yeah. So the Russians are intervening in these places where the government is weakening or collapsed, just like a lot of other people. They've intervened in Libya, they've intervened in Syria. But Russia has also developed a very interesting relationship with Saudi Arabia, right? Seemingly on the other side of this civil war, because Russia and Saudi Arabia are two of the three biggest oil producers in the world, right? And the third oil producer is the US. And we don't have a Putin, we don't have a minister of oil. So we can't engage in oil negotiations, right? You'd have to negotiate with, you know, all of my neighbors down here in Texas for how much oil that they're gonna produce. But Putin and the Saudis can negotiate on how much oil they're going to produce in an effort to try to stabilize markets. Sometimes they disagree and you get price wars. That was, you know, we saw the collapse of oil prices during the beginning of the COVID crisis, right? Because the Russians and the Saudis were spitting at each other about oil production levels. Well, the Saudis opened the spigots, drove the price of oil way, way down, and the Russians basically said, okay, we'll come and negotiate. So the Russians and the Saudis have an interesting relationship. But to tell the truth, I don't think the Russians have much to bring to the region. They have their own problems domestically. With oil prices down, their own economy is problematic. They don't have the kind of military power that the Soviet Union used to have. And frankly, if Vladimir Putin wants to be Bashar al-Assad's lawyer, I say let him. I don't really worry that much about Russian influence in the Middle East.
Yes. Just me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Oh.
I would like to ask the speaker his opinion about Israel's response to Iran's threat to resume development of nuclear capability. And what does he project? How does he project this will play out?
So I was a big fan of the Iran nuclear deal under the Obama administration. I think that the U.S. is really bad in terms of dealing with places where the leadership doesn't have an address. So it's bad in civil wars, but we're pretty good about dealing with countries that have an address, right, and a phone number, where you can actually bring to bear the enormous resources of power in the international system the United States has. And that's what the Obama administration did with the Iranians. And I thought walking the Iranians back from nuclear breakout capability was a real diplomatic success and lowered the temperature in the region. I never understood the complaints that President Trump and other people had about the deal, that it was a roadmap for the Iranians to get nuclear weapons. So they were a lot closer to getting nuclear breakout capability before the Iran nuclear deal than they were when the deal was in place. So that's a puzzle to me. Obviously, with the Iran nuclear deal over and the United States exercising a policy of maximum pressure on Iran, the Iranians are thumbing their nose at us by restarting their nuclear program. This is also the reason why they launched that drone attack on the Saudi oil facilities. This will raise tensions, but neither the Iranians nor the Israelis are drastic risk takers. And the Iranians are certainly not suicidal. I don't think that the Iranians are going to, in any way, effectively threaten the Israelis with nuclear weapons, as much as their rhetoric might indicate. And I think that the Israelis know that their ability to strike at Iran, which is at much greater distance than Syria or even northern Iraq, which they hit in the early 80s when Saddam Hussein was developing nuclear weapons, is much reduced in terms of military effectiveness. And I don't think the United States would want the Israelis to initiate military action with Iran that could then escalate into something worse. So while I don't find that the Iranian resumption of its nuclear, of the expansion of its nuclear program to be a good thing, it's a bad thing, and it will raise tensions. I actually think the chances of the actual use of nuclear weapons between Israel and Iran is extremely low. What's more likely to happen is proliferation elsewhere in the region, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Turkey. I think that is something that the Iranians, at the end of the Iranian nuclear deal, increases the chances of proliferation in both Turkey and in Saudi Arabia. And the more nuclear powers there are in the Middle East, the greater the likelihood at some point of some kind of nuclear use.
Excellent. Last question, CD again. Yes. Can you unmute him, Jolene?
We got you.
Yeah.
One of the things I thought you'd make reference to as far as the area of democracy in the different countries in the Middle East has to do with a sustained economy. And you really didn't touch on that unless you said some things in a veiled manner. But I've been in the area a couple different places. But one of the things that I have is some friends that have come over from Iraq and Iran that I get contacts with because they have contacts with people with their families still in those countries. And granted, that is a very minor educational effort, if you will, on my part, but I'm always interested to hear what they have to say. And it is fluid as different things are going. And from the time that we went in and effectively destroyed the state of Iraq, there was it was a great economy that was ongoing at the time, granted with not a lot of freedoms, if you will, for the average Joe, but those people that were involved in the economy had something going for them, and they kept the state or the people sustained. And of course, when that happened, people left, and the same thing has happened in other countries. So how do you see building back the economies if it's just about oil?
It's going to be extremely difficult. Almost all of these economies are state-led economies, very, very little in terms of private sector involvement. Partially that's because many of them are oil countries, and that money comes into the state, right? The oil is sold by the state, the money comes into the state employs lots of people.
Distributes it.
Yeah. But even in countries that are not oil producers, you had a long period in the 50s and 60s of socialist economies into the 70s. And even governments like Tunisia and Egypt that realized that they had to loosen up and empower a private sector didn't want to give up all the political control and didn't want to completely privatize the economy because they sustained the lower classes through subsidies of basic foodstuffs and government jobs and things like that. So I'm not very optimistic, okay? First off, it's tough to have a decent economy in a civil war. So just, all those countries are having civil wars, you're going to be in trouble. Oil has been a driver of the economies of this region for some time. And oil prices are $40 a barrel, less than 40, and probably not going up anytime soon. And thus, I think that the combination of unrest, lower oil prices, and real political risks, if you really open up the market, will make it difficult. I mean, there are some places where there are some success stories. One can look at Morocco in the agricultural field and access to the EU market. One can look at Turkey, which had a booming economy in the 2000s and into the 2010s. Troubles now, but and so there have been private sector reforms that have worked in Middle Eastern states, but there are real obstacles to getting these economies back on their feet.
Thank you.
Okay, that was our final question. Definitely an excellent discussion. Thank you again, Dr. Gause, and thank you everyone for attending this evening. I know it's a much different format than we are used to, and sorry that there was no food involved. My name is Jolene Volmer, and I am the Vice President of Programming for WACI. And I wanted to thank everyone that is already a member of WACI, but for those who are not, I would like to show you how you can become a member of WACI. So you should be able to see the World Affairs Council webpage on your screen, which is mywaci.org. And if you click right here, become a member, this is where you can click on the link to fill out the 2020 to 2021 membership form. I also wanted to make sure that everyone was aware on our website, we do keep it up to date with the future programs that WACI will be offering. So the next one is on Thursday, October 15th at 7 p.m. It will be done this exact same format via Zoom, and it will be on the diplomatic challenges and opportunities for U.S.-Cuba relations. So I hope that we see everyone back at that event in October. Also on our website, there is a link for our Facebook page. So for any of you that are on Facebook, I encourage you to like our Facebook page. We keep all the events up to date on that page as well. And so this concludes our program. Thank you again, Dr. Gause, and we just hope that we see everyone back here in October. And let's give a round of applause, if you can, for Dr. Gause.
That was one of the better stage. I mean, the graphics were there, the people were asking questions were, I mean, I thought that technically it was one of the best Zoom. I don't know if you can